Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
How often do you really think about your food? The food that you buy at the grocery store and eat every day. How often do you really think about it? How often do you wonder to yourself whether that food might be contaminated, whether it might not be safe to eat? Food safety is a luxury in this country. It's something that we take for granted every day. I know I'm certainly guilty of it. You get home from the store, maybe somebody calls, you leave the bag on the counter, it sits out for half an hour before that raw meat goes away. I even sometimes forget to wash my vegetables. I know, it's gross. I'm not a perfect person. But seriously, think about it for a second. How often do you wonder about your food? I think we all take it for granted that we assume if it came from the store, it's safe to eat. But how safe is it? How well is the food safety system working in Canada? I'm David Smith. Today on the Big Story podcast, I'm in conversation with Keith Warrnier, professor in the Department of Food Sciences at the University of Guelph. He is a Canadian food safety expert, a past president of the Ontario Food Protection Association. Hi, Professor.
Oh, hi there, David.
Thanks for making the time. I appreciate it. So, a lot of people have been feeling like there have been more and more stories about food recalls in the news lately, and I don't blame them for that. In the last year and a half, 12 people in Canada have lost their lives to outbreaks of foodborne illnesses. 9 people died from salmonella last year, contracted from contaminated cantaloupe. 3 people lost their lives more recently to listeria found in plant-based milk products. And just in the last couple of weeks, baby carrots, potentially containing E. coli, pulled from shelves after an American died in an E. coli outbreak south of the border. This week, cucumbers, possibly contaminated with salmonella, have been pulled from the shelves, prompted by a national recall as well. So I'll start with the obvious question first, Professor. Has there been an increase to these food recalls, or does it just feel that way?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. The reality is we hear more about recalls on the news at the much more high level. But typically in Canada, we use about 800 recalls a year. And for the vast majority, we don't hear about them. The biggest cause of recalls is always allergens. It's been like that for a long time, maybe undeclared nuts and things like that. But I think what's happened, certainly in the last 12 months, is this increase in number of outbreaks, people suffering, people dying from them. And really that's what the big news is that so we seem to be getting more outbreaks, but is it as that simple in terms of they're occurring more, or are we detecting more? And I suspect it's a cross between the two. I think the tools to detect outbreaks now with the DNA sequencing and fingerprinting has made source attribution much more likely. And when we talk about source attribution, we're saying we get a contaminated product, can we link it to cases? And that significantly increased, although it's only around about 20-30% at the moment. Much better than it used to be 10 years ago, I'll give you that. So I think it's a mixture of things. One is that we're better at detecting outbreaks, but the other thing is that we've had failings in the food safety system, and I think they're kind of coming home to roost in certain ways. So, but people are right. We're getting more outbreaks, more deaths, and these might be numbers for sure, but there's always someone behind those numbers who's suffering and things like that.
Yeah, but it is both. You say we are getting, because the old adage is always, it's not happening more. We're just finding it more. We're reporting on it more. But in your opinion, there is more to report on, even as we've gotten better at identifying these outbreaks. Just to recap, is that right?
Oh, for sure. So, basically, if we detect outbreaks, that's a failure of the food safety system because obviously contaminated products got through. So, in reality, yes, we've detected more outbreaks, linking them up, whereas they wouldn't go undetected normally. But we're certainly getting an abnormal kind of instance of food incidents. I look back to the early ooze. I think that was the only real time we got so many, but there seem to be one after another these days for sure.
Okay. So, what are the most common foodborne illnesses, and how do those bacteria usually get into food?
All right, so I think we all suffered from norovirus, also known as the 24-hour flu, also known as the winter flu. And that, bar none, is the biggest foodborne pathogen. So typically that's food handlers, things like that. But if we look at the sort of down the food chain, certainly salmonella and Campylobacter are the two that really show up on the sort of foodborne pathogen most wanted list, or unwanted, should we say. So the very contrasting pathogen, salmonella, is like this tank. It's built to survive in the environment. And obviously its original source is animal production. And animals do what they do best, produce manure. And that manure can get into waterways. It can get put onto land. It can basically persist for a long time, and even get into facilities. If we think about sort of peanut factories and that, there's kind of an endemic population. But then we take Campylobacter, which is a softie. Campylobacter doesn't survive very well. It goes into a dormant state. But the common feature of those two is that poultry is the key source of the pathogen. And what can happen, obviously, is that when we get into the kitchen, we can mishandle it and spread it around the kitchen. Obviously, we can undercook things. That's the other part about it. So they're the most prevalent pathogens. But then we come to the ones that there's not so many cases, but when we do get them, they're severe. And I think you can guess these. One is listeria monocytogenes. So in Canada, we get about 2,000 cases a year, typically. And the thing with this pathogen, the reason why it's fairly low numbers, but you wouldn't say that if you're suffering from it, but it's very significant, is that 30% of the time it results in death, 30% mortality rate. And a bit like the outbreaks we've just had with the almond milk, listeria just likes to live in lots of different places, in the field, in the processing plant, and they can really contaminate foods that way, be it almond milk, be it deli meats, or be it things like that. But then we get to another pathogen, which was associated with the onions and more recently the carrots, and that's toxigenic E. coli. And this is a very serious one. So this can cause the hemolytic urine syndrome. And the way that gets into our food supply is, again, multiple routes, but mainly the sort of reserve is the animal again, things like cattle, sheep and things like that. And it gets into manure, and the manure runs off into the river, or it runs off into irrigation canals or onto land. And it can contaminate crops like fresh produce and things like that. And the reason why that's so severe is, 10 to 100 cells could cause illness, which is pretty devastating. So in terms of foodborne illness, we have a range of pathogens. Like I've just named about 5 of them, but there's many more than that, but they're the kind of significant ones.
Right. So it seems like then the point of contamination is typically high up in the chain of production. It's at the point of production, on the farm, so to speak, rather than in a factory or what have you.
Some cases. So, for example, with norovirus, it's probably food service. With listeria, it's probably the processing plant. But with things like E. coli and salmonella and Campylobacter, the origins of them are typically on the farm, during production.
Gotcha. So, food inspection. We have the Canada Food Inspection Agency in this country. What goes into inspecting the food? How big an operation is that?
Well, it's certainly a challenging one. The CFIA, for example, have around about 5,000 to 6,000 inspectors, and there's over 13,000 food processing facilities within Canada. That's not even counting the small ones or food service and things like that. So the philosophy for the last 40 years is that food safety is responsibility of the processor, the people who actually process the food. And what the inspectors do is more like a police force, go around just making sure everyone's doing the right thing. They're not there meant to educate them, they're just there to police it. And within Canada, we realise we've got a few inspectors, but obviously many more facilities. So what we do is a risk-based system. So when we talk about risk-based systems, these are those operations that are most likely to be high risk of contaminating food or supplying food, things like that. Things like meat factories, for example, slaughterhouses, places of that nature. They have their dedicated CFA inspectors. And other places which are considered less risk are basically inspected less. And a good example of this is sort of the almond milk, which we had over the summer. So because it was heat-treated almond milk, that was considered low risk and hence not inspected. I think they had one inspection in 3 years. And so basically that's where the sort of risk-based system falls over. But another important aspect, though, is that a few years ago, maybe 20 years ago is the initiation, is that we started to rely more on what we call third-party auditors. So third-party auditors are private companies that will go in to do a food inspection. Now, typically that would be for the retailer. So, the retailers of the land say, we want to make sure we don't sell food that's contaminated, so we're going to send auditors in. And for the last few years, people have looked at these auditors as an alternative to federal inspectors, and not only here in Canada, in the US as well. Now, where it falls short is that when I always say privatize the inspection service. I think that's a bit of a strong word, but when you give it to third parties, obviously you're hoping that they'll have the same rigor and standards as government inspectors. But the reality is these processors are paid by the processors, and if they don't like a report, they can unduly get another auditor to get one that's true. And this happened in the Boar's Head down in the US with listeria. So the way the government inspects facilities is that, as I said, this sort of philosophy that food processors are responsible for food safety. We're just there to kind of go around, have an inspection. We're not there really to catch contamination. We're just there to make sure things are going right. And one of the big deficiencies, apart from having few inspectors to facilities, and this happened in the Calgary daycare, it also happened in the US, is that when they do go to do the inspection, they find deficiencies, but they fail to follow up on them. They say, well, you've got condensate dripping on your product, but no inspector would go back and say, well, did you fix it? And again, this is where the system falls apart. So inspection isn't easy. Basically, it's a very complex thing, but at the end of the day, it's the food processor who's responsible for food safety, not so much the food inspector.
That change that you're talking about, more contracting out to third parties of the inspection, when did that happen, and why did that happen?
All right, so basically we can trace it back to 2001. So back then, we knew there was issues with the food safety system. We had this sort of what we call hazard analysis, critical control points going for 15 years. And it just wasn't having the effect on the foodborne illness cases. So government said, we're going to modernise. And they started this journey in 2001. And it took them 11 years to get to the point of putting an act called the Food Safety Modernisation Act. In Canada, we followed the US diligently. So we had the Safe Foods for Canadians Act. And it was another 5 years before we actually got new regulations. So back in 2001, the retailers looked at this and said, this is too slow. We'll do it ourselves. And so they established something called a Global Food Safety Initiative, which were basically retailers getting together to say, this is how we want our food standards to be. And so they would send out auditors to they'll have a collection of retailers. So each retailer doesn't need to send their own auditor. They can just send this auditor, you're representing all those retailers. And they would inspect. And the problem early on was recognized that facilities were demanding really high marks, basically 95%. And because it's such a competitive business, the auditing business, basically, if you didn't give them a good mark, they would literally get somebody who did. And the other aspect of it is that the auditing company were the same people who have actually established the food safety management system. So you got to the point where you say, well, these private companies, they tell what standards a company should go for, and the company pays them very good, $1 billion sometimes. And then they're the same people who audit it. And some people suggest, which is correct, that's a conflict of interest. And that's where the auditing systems come to the point now where people are really questioning what is the value of an audit score when it's always going to be so high. So this was when it all initiated and the reasons for it.
Really interesting. Okay, I would suspect that most people don't know that that's how the system is functioning right now. So when it comes to a recall, who makes that decision ultimately? What is the threshold there, and when do they actually tell stores you cannot sell this product anymore?
Yeah, so there's different reasons to have a product recall. So one of the most serious ones, obviously, is when we're in the middle of an outbreak, and we have cases of salmonella or listeria going on. And so they're detected, and if they're traced back to a certain facility, the government will ask the company to do a voluntary recall. Now, obviously, the company might push back and say no, which is very rare, but it has happened. And if they refuse to a recall, then the Minister of Health can do a mandatory recall. But as I mentioned, typically, there has to do a voluntary recall. So obviously an outbreak being linked to a product. The other means of a recall is if, for example, the CFAA goes sampling retail shelves, which they do, and through their routine sampling, they find a bag of lettuce with lettuce in or listeria in. They, again, go to the industry and say, right, you better recall this product. Now, the company can also do recalls. So in the case of the waffle recall, for example, with listeria, they detect the listeria during their routine sampling of the environment, and they would recall it because it's not worth a risk. So the product recalls are up to the company again. It's not really the government, although the government can step in to actually mandatory give a recall. And the ones that didn't actually was not here in Canada, but in the US. There was an outbreak of salmonella to do with chicken. It was a very virulent salmonella, and it was to do with Foster Farms, which is like the Maple Leaf of the US, a very friendly, warm family business. And they refused to do a recall. So what they tended to happen is that they made a case against them, and they actually had to recall due to insect infestation. So the reason I bring this up is that even though you think the government is going to be very powerful to say, you recall that product, there can be legal challenges. And the thing is, though, I've never seen in Canada a company refuse to do a recall when they're asked to. So obviously, they've got their name, the brand to protect and things like that.
Okay, that's really interesting, because I was going to ask as well, it may seem like a very basic question, but I wanted to ask you because you're the expert, so recalls generally voluntary from the company, but if a company were to say refuse to do a recall and somebody dies, are they held liable for that? Is there a penalty for a bad actor in that circumstance?
Certainly there is. The reality is even if they recall the product and they're responsible for illness and death, they'll get fined by the government. But typically the government is a very small fine. Well, when we say small, it's tens of thousands. And if they they usually get a warning letter before, and then they'll get they'll get what we call license withdrawn, which essentially means you can't function as a business. Now, where the big money comes in, litigation-wise, is obviously the big case, litigation cases, which could literally bankrupt companies. So on the government side, yeah, they do issue fines, but people like Bill Marler, who's a famous litigation lawyer, once they get class action lawsuits, they get compensation for their sort of clients, and we're talking hundreds of millions. So in Canada, we never used to have this sort of litigation philosophy like they do in the US. The main reason because our healthcare is free. But I've noticed over these last few years, there's been very big litigation cases launched. So certainly as a business, one thing is the fine and the sort of warnings from the government. The second is obviously the big payouts, which typically are insurance, but it's a loss of reputation. I'll give you an example. I don't know if you remember back to the maple leaf outbreak of 2008.
I was gonna bring that up. I was in middle school at the time, but that's the one that sticks out for me in my lifetime when you think about reputation lost for a company. Maple Leaf Foods took a serious hit after that, didn't they?
Well, you're making me feel old now, but you're right. It's they took a $24 million fine due to the fact that 24 million people died. They were a bit tardy in terms of paying it off, but the reality was they lost something like $300 million of sales, and they only recovered back to their baseline. I think it was something like 6 years afterwards. So, and the reputation gets burnt. Now, if they were doing the same today, I don't think there would be a Maple Leafs food. I think it'll be very similar to Boar's Head, which got facing $100 million worth of litigation. So this is how it works in the philosophy that, fines will make a difference. But in the US, what I've noticed is that you're also getting indictments. So basically, the CEOs of these companies are being sent to prison for the fact that they caused this foodborne illness outbreak, even though they probably never even went on the processing floor. So it's all this sort of balance between the stick in terms of, well, do fines work? Do litigations work? Does prison work? To try and get companies to do the right thing.
Okay. In closing today, to tie a bow on this whole package, in your expert opinion, is our food safe? And what would you say to someone who may be feeling a little bit anxious, having some tribulations about these recent recalls and the state of the food safety system?
Well, the reality is, compared to, say, 10 years ago, our food system is safer. It's kind of getting there. But the frustrating part about it is that we could be doing better. So, for example, the big deficiency in today's system is that we have all these regulations, we have all these food safety management plans, but it's just that we don't apply them. It's likened to a football team. You've got a really good plan when you're in the dressing room, but when you go out to play in the field, you totally forgot the plan and you're doing what you wish. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect, obviously, is that we are getting better at detecting outbreaks. And how many we used to miss is very significant. I would even estimate we were missing 80 to 90% of all outbreaks previously. So at least we're doing better in that regard. But the other aspect we've got to think about is that we're getting an older population now. The reality is old people like me and things like that are more susceptible to foodborne illness. And so we have to be more careful. So even though the food safety is enhancing, so are the high-risk groups, the elderly, immunocompromised, and the very young. And we have to kind of protect ourselves. And I always suggest to people in those high-risk groups is that always avoid ready-to-eat foods. Ready-to-eat foods are convenient. They don't need extra cooking. But, cooking is one of those sort of defenses we have because it'll kill off any pathogens. But you just got to be careful never to take a risk, especially if you're in a high-risk group, because some of these pathogens are lethal. And even if you survive the infection, it's those secondary effects that really affect you. So for sure, the reality is like fresh produce, for example, number one cause of foodborne illness outbreaks. But the reality is it's also the most healthiest thing to include in your diet. So you just be cautious, look for the what's being recalled, what's on the market. But I keep mentioning, never take chances if you don't need to.
And wash your lettuce. Washing your lettuce is a good idea, yes?
Only if it makes you feel better. A study has shown that there's a greater risk of contamination from the kitchen. You're sponging that if you wash your lettuce. Obviously, if you've got whole heads of lettuce, you have to wash off the soil. That's not good. But for bag salads, you wouldn't wash them for the simple reason there's a greater risk of you contaminating the product than decontaminating it.
Right. Okay. I did not know that. Okay, that's interesting. All right. Well, that's our time for today's conversation, Professor. But you've made me feel better about the state of things. The reality is, the system is not perfect, but by and large, and especially compared to other less developed countries, certainly the food that we buy at the grocery store is safe to eat for the most part. Yes.
We eat billions of meals a day, and we're still here. But when outbreaks do occur, they're pretty devastating. But certainly, we're much better off than we were years ago and compared to other countries.
Okay. All right. We'll leave it there for today, Professor Warrnier. Thank you so much again for your time.
Oh, no, thank you.
Again, that is Professor Keith Warrnier, professor in the Department of Food Sciences at the University of Guelph, past president of the Ontario Food Protection Association. That's it for the big story today. Hopefully you're all feeling better now about the safety of your food. Again, even though those scary headlines are in the news, and they are in the news more frequently, on the whole, our expert says the food in Canada is safe. I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening today. A quick reminder, again, about the Seeker app. Great new listening experience. Seeker, Seekr. You can find that on the App Store or Google Play. It's a great way to get all of your audio content, podcasts, radio, all in the same place. That's the Seeker app, Seekr. It's green. The icon for it is green. Look for the green icon. The Seeker app. Check that out, seriously. You won't regret it. That's all for me. Until next time, thank you for listening.